My name is Janine Zakaria, and on behalf of the World Affairs Council, I would like to welcome you to our morning keynote session on the Second Arab Awakening. We're delighted and honored to have with us two distinguished speakers, Ambassador Marwan Muasher, who's the former Deputy Prime Minister and Foreign Minister of Jordan, among many other titles that he's held over the years, and Shadi Hamid is a fellow at the Saban Center for Middle East Policy Studies at the Brookings Institution. Both, as I can attest personally, are two of Washington and indeed the world's experts on Middle East politics in general and the forces that are shaping the region today. The way it's going to work this morning is each of our speakers will speak for about 20 minutes, and then we're going to have a moderated Q&A session. So I encourage you while they're speaking to jot down questions. You should have note cards on your table, which I will try to get to as many of them as I can in the 35-minute Q&A session at the end, and we'll end promptly at 10:15. You know, President Obama has wanted to shift to Asia, as you may have heard. He's wanted to pivot there. But what we're going to see this morning is that's going to be quite difficult for him in the remaining time he has in this term, and perhaps for his successor who follows him, because of what's been happening in the Middle East and what I expect will continue to happen in the Middle East. Nearly 4 years after civil unrest and protests sparked transformations across the Arab world, we're sitting down with these two prominent Arab scholars for what I expect will be a frank discussion of this deeply troubled and often misunderstood region in transition. And we're going to try and explore what the future of Arab politics fundamentally are going to be and what it means for us here in the United States. We're going to try and answer the question of whether liberal democracy, not just any kind of democracy where you have elections and things like that, can take hold when you've got dictators and Islamists, some of whom are very new to this whole idea of governing from the inside, are having a very often bloody, deadly struggle for power. What's going to be the future of this political Islam? I think that's what we're going to try and drill down on. And what can the role be for the West? Should we get out of the way, or can we help build what we hope will be a new, more prosperous, progressive Arab world? Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Ambassador Marwan Muasher and Shadi Hamid.
Thank you very much, Janine. Thank you. I'm grateful to the World Affairs Council to be here today. I'm very glad to have also my colleague Shadi Hamid with me this morning. What I will try to do today is just attempt to give you some nuance about the developments that took place in the last 3 years, and hopefully convince you to move away from what I think has been an extremely simplistic argument about the Arab uprisings since they started 3 years ago. And that is because the departure point for most people, in my view, has been inaccurate. For most people, they called this an Arab Spring right from day one, and romantically expected that just because you get rid of dictators, that democracy is somehow going to flourish overnight in a region that has not known it probably ever. And equally simplistically, once that did not, of course, take place across the Arab world, people today call it an Arab inferno and expect that the Arab world is going to descend into the dark ages for the foreseeable future. That is the wrong departure point. There is no transformational process in history that unfolded in a short 3 years? None. Why should the Arab world be different escapes me. Even the Ukraine today, right? We all remember the Orange Revolution of 2004, and it's still going on today. 25 years after the fall of the Berlin Wall, Poland today is doing much better than Bulgaria or Romania. But we tend to forget this. The more accurate departure point from my point of view is that the status quo in the Arab world was simply not sustainable. And as a result, this is a process that needed to happen, that should have happened. And the question was, why did it not happen even before it did 3 years ago? In a region that was really where stability was kept artificially under a lid, the world looked at the Arab region as a stable region somehow in countries like Egypt and elsewhere, and expected that stability basically to remain for the foreseeable future. That also did not happen. And once the lid was lifted, to go back to natural stability is going to take a very long time. So that's my first point is, please be patient. This is not going to unfold in 3, 5, 10, or 20 years. This is going to take decades. And that the Arab world, even though it is called an Arab world, is also not monolithic. Europe is not monolithic either. The example about Poland and Bulgaria, the Arab world is the same. You are going to see different transition models. We are already seeing them, some more successful than others. Everybody today focuses on what is going on in Syria and Egypt to a certain extent because of the turmoil and the violence, and use that as examples of why the uprisings have not gone as expected. But we tend to forget also that not everything that is transpiring in the Arab world today is negative. And 3 short years after the uprisings, there are already some important and potentially very positive signs that we are witnessing. I want to talk about 3 transition models so far. There are many. But if you take at least 3 transition models, the Tunisian model, the Egyptian model, and the Syrian model. I call the Tunisian model the inclusionist model, the Egyptian model the convoluted model, and the Syrian model, of course, the horrific model. And it is clear already in 3 short years that those who have adopted pluralism and inclusion as their operating system are doing well. And those who have not and tried to rule by excluding others from the process, sometimes peacefully and sometimes not, are not doing well. If there is a lesson as simple as that, it is this, that in a transition, you can choose to include all forces of society like the Tunisians did, or you can choose to play a zero-sum game where the winner takes all and where you exclude all other people and forces from your system, and of course things do not go well. In Tunisia today, 3 short years after the uprisings, the Tunisians have already agreed through an inclusion process that included a coalition government, a constitution writing process that was arrived at by consensus. The Tunisians today have a constitution which is by far the most forward-looking constitution the modern Arab world has ever known. A constitution that upholds total parity between men and women, a constitution that upholds the right of notion of peaceful rotation of power at all times. And listen to this, a constitution that upholds the right to believe or not to believe. And this is a first, certainly in the region, arrived at and agreed to by this Islamist force in society. You contrast that to what is going on in Egypt, where they did not go for a constitution at first. They went for elections, and once the elections were won by the Islamists last year, the Islamists took that win at a particular point in time to mean that they can basically dictate what society is going to be like at all times. They pushed through a constitution that did not enjoy consensus among all forces in society. And as a result, the same street that brought them to power went against them this year. Unfortunately, that has been mitigated by the intervention by the military in what, in my view, has been a coup. And today, the secular elements in Egypt are exercising the same policies that they accused the Islamists of exercising last year. So if the Islamists ruled exclusively, today the secular elements are ruling exclusively as well. And as a result, the Egyptians today are involved in a zero-sum game where the sum is zero. And whereas General Sisi is a popular man today, I doubt that in a year's time, once people look at the economic performance of Egypt, that he will hold that popularity for much longer. But that also is not negative. In my view, what this has also is showing us is that the region where, the era where ideology basically ruled in the Arab world, whether it was secular ideology or religious ideology, is coming to an end. The Arab world tried the secular ideology of Pan-Arabism for a long time, thinking it was the solution to all the problems, and it was shattered in 1967 with the loss of the war with Israel. And then Islamists presented themselves as the answer to all the problems. Islam is the solution, without ever translating that slogan into practical, pragmatic solutions. And they could afford to do that because they were artificially kept out of the system by secular forces which ruled the Arab world until the Arab uprisings. Once they were voted in by the electorate, and once they had to prove how Islam is the solution, is going to solve practical problems, they actually did a lot to weaken themselves, more to weaken themselves than 50 or 60 or 70 years of Arab governments trying to weaken them by keeping them outside the political system were able to do. And today, both, in my view, political Islam and secular, the traditional secular forces in the Arab world have lost their holiness. It is no longer taboo to criticize either. It is no longer taboo to tell the Islamists Islam is the solution is not enough if you don't translate it into practical problems, just as the Arab street also told the secular forces, your policies are not enough if you don't show us how to improve our lot. The polls are very clear, by the way, on these points, for those who want to read them. The Arab street in Egypt, the Egyptians, by all polls, are extremely conservative and extremely religious. Over 90% of Egyptians identify with themselves as religious and conservative. However, that same street does not want its government to tell it how to be conservative and religious. Talk to any taxi driver in Egypt, and he would tell you this. I know how to be a Muslim. I don't need the government to tell me about how to be a Muslim. I want them to worry about the economy. 70% of Egyptians, 70% want their government to worry about the economy. 2% want their government to worry about ideology. And that is, I think, a very important lesson as well, that the monopoly on political life that has been exercised so far by the two major forces in the Arab world, the Arab elites who have ruled the Arab world until now, and the religious opposition have basically failed to produce pragmatic results for the Arab people. And I think we are entering a new phase today where delivery is going to be the solution, where the street will decide on the popularity of their government through performance, not ideology. And the street basically is not going to care whether their government is secular or religious. If it delivers on the economy, they will succeed. If it does not, they will not. And in my view, that is the real battle in the Arab world today. It should not be a battle of secularism against Islamism. Because if the Arab world makes it such a battle, then whoever wins that battle becomes simply the new dictator of the Arab world. And we are seeing this very clearly in Egypt. Whoever makes it a battle for pluralism, in other words, to put in place institutions that pave the ground for stability and natural stability and prosperity in the future, as I think the Tunisians are doing, is going to be successful. The third point I want to leave with you is democracy is not going to just, pop up on its own in the Arab world. Those who look at the Arab world from a distance and judge it to doom and failure are only exercising, engaging in a self-fulfilling prophecy. Because if nothing is done, of course, the Arab world is going to go into doom and darkness. In every vacuum created anywhere in the world, radical forces were able to exploit this vacuum. We have seen it in Iraq. Not a single member of Al-Qaeda existed in Iraq until the Iraq War 10 years ago. Not a single member of Al-Qaeda existed in Syria until the uprisings. Radical forces, of course, are going to exploit vacuums. And therefore, whoever wants the Arab world to be democratic from now on is going to have to roll up their sleeves and do it on the ground. Gone are the times in the Arab world where, and I'm talking to the secular elements in particular, who many of them either lectured from podiums or expected their lifestyles to be guaranteed by dictators in return for these dictators then going and abusing the rights of the rest of society. If women in Tunisia were happy about Bourguiba giving them their rights by brute force, they should be much happier today that their rights today have been acquired through work on the ground and through consensus by all forces in society, including the Islamists. If Christians in Syria are worried about their future in Syria and therefore, continuing to support a dictator regime like the Assad regime, they are simply engaging in a self-fulfilling prophecy where they will be seen as having, had a blind eye about all the atrocities that the Assad regime is doing. The question of national identities, the question of citizenship, and what it means to be a citizen is no more a question that can be ignored in the Arab world. The Arab world, particularly the eastern part of it, has lived for a long time, at least the last 100 years, where sub-identities were always more important than national identities. Today, it is still more important to be, or people think of themselves as Kurds before they think of themselves as Syrians or Iraqis. They think of themselves as Christians, Maronites before they think of themselves as Lebanese, etc. That is not a formula for prosperity in the future. I don't have a lot of hope on the existing generation, on my generation certainly in the Arab world, whether it is secular or religious. My generation has proved that it does not believe in democracy, and that at best it believes in selective democracy, meaning that if the result is to your liking, then you are a Democrat. If it is not, then you are ready to basically cooperate with anybody in order to preserve your lifestyle. My generation, the train has passed it by, and I really believe that hope rests with a new generation, which is not necessarily, great on its own, but if there is work to be done, it is work to be done on the ground with a new generation, which is at least more exposed to the rest of the world, that understands, at least more than their parents do, the need for pluralism and democracy, not as a guarantor for success, but as a necessary condition, and that understand that they need to do work on the ground for decades, including, and I devote a whole chapter in my book about it, including changing the educational system in the Arab world. We have to have an educational system which encourages critical thinking, questioning of authority, tolerance, acceptance of other points of view, research capabilities, communication skills, all the skills that were denied the previous generations in an attempt to, create docile societies that don't question their governments. And of course, the result has been totally the opposite. What was created are frustrated societies not able to work to compete in the marketplace, and the result has been clear. I devote my book, I want to end with this, therefore, to the new generation of the Arab world. And I say this is to the youth of the Arab world who revolted not against their parents, but on their behalf. Thank you.
Hello, it's a pleasure to be with all of you. Thanks to the World Affairs Council for having me, and thanks to Marwan for setting the stage so very well. Let me just start with February 11th, 2011. I was in Tahrir Square when Mubarak fell, and it was really a remarkable moment. I mean, one of the most beautiful moments I can remember in my life, where you had this, so when it was announced, you just had this kind of buzz, building, and then cheering, and it was remarkable to be there, to be part of it. And I remember later that night, I was writing an article in a coffee shop. People were dancing in the streets and all that. And I overheard an Egyptian woman saying, "I've never seen Egyptians so happy in my life," and she was right. And when I kind of look back at that moment, it kind of makes me a little bit sad. Let's fast forward a little bit. August 14th, 2013, in Egypt, we have what Human Rights Watch called the worst mass killing in modern Egyptian history. So how did we get from there to here? And I was actually in Egypt just a couple days before that massacre. There were tens of thousands of Muslim Brotherhood supporters in Rabat protesting after the military coup, which was on July 3rd. So I was there, and I was talking to, friends and family and people that I know in Egypt, people that I care about, that I like, maybe even love. Many of my relatives are still in Egypt. And it was so shocking to hear what some of them were saying. They were part of the secular elite, and they were essentially calling for this sit-in to be wiped out, women, children, whatever. So you essentially had people actively calling for mass slaughter. And I actually remember I was talking to a family friend, and he got very emotional, and he said, he kind of laid it out on the table. He wants the heads of the leaders of the Muslim Brotherhood on the table, and he made a chopping sound on the table, and it was very kind of morbid and graphic. And I had a family I had a relative who on Facebook called for the mass execution of Muslim Brotherhood members without due process, and he felt a need to emphasize the latter part, without due process. So, so that kind of raised a lot of, it's obviously depressing, but fascinating questions about how can people who so seemingly and quickly embraced democracy in 2011 turn against it in just a matter of 2 or 3 years. And I think this isn't just about politics. There's a bigger story here. There's something deeper here. How can people who are otherwise sensible, intelligent, Western educated, effectively lose their humanity? And when I was in Egypt in August before that massacre, I mean, that's what kept on coming up to me. And we read about it in graduate school, fascism, Europe, the religious wars of the past. But to actually see it, to feel it, and to talk to people, because usually when you support killing people, you feel a little bit bad about it, you kind of try to be circumspect and all that, right? But in Egypt, there wasn't that shame, and people were very open about this sentiment, this kind of bloodlust, if you will. So, something went wrong, and I think we as analysts on the outside, maybe we got caught up in the euphoria after February 11th, 2011. We wanted to believe that this was the future. And maybe we got it wrong a little bit, and we should have warned of the dangers more. And that kind of raises a question. Is there something exceptional about the Arab world? And Egypt is a kind of microcosm or reflective of this. Egypt is kind of the worst case, but elsewhere in the region, you see this kind of this bloodlust, this ideological divide, this hatred between citizens. In places like Syria, of course, Bahrain, even Tunisia, secularists and Islamists hate each other, but the good thing is they decided to work that out through the political process, not through killing each other, but there still is this real cultural, ideological divide between people who have very different views about the future. And I think this gets us to one of the unique problems, in my view, unique problems in the Arab world today. In Latin America and other transitions in the 1970s, 80s, and more recently, the fundamental divide, there was an ideological component, but it was fundamentally economic. You had socialists or communists on one hand, and then kind of right-wing neoliberal, whatever you want to call them, on the right. And on economics, you can split the difference. You can actually have a tangible discussion about that, because ultimately you're talking about material interests. So in those transitions, they were able to reassure each other that certain material interests would be protected. I think what makes the Arab world so difficult is it's not tangible. The Islamist secular divide is about things that are sort of metaphysical in a way, about the role of religion in public life, the meaning and boundaries of the nation state, the identity of the state. You can't put a figure on that. And that makes it very difficult to have, a reasoned discussion around these issues. So we thought that, for example, Egypt was relatively homogenous. 90% of the population is Arab, Sunni. Tribalism isn't a big problem in Egypt, unlike, say, in Syria, where you have a very clear divide between Sunni and Shia. Now, what's interesting about Egypt is, despite this homogenous population, what makes it even more, some ways more frightening, is that the divides happen within families. You have brother against brother, father against son, and Islamist and secular isn't something very clear. You don't always know who's an Islamist and who's a secularist. Many people are somewhere in between. And both sides think they have the majority of the population on their side. So this leads to a kind of populism that we speak for the people and we're the right ones. And as Marwan said, it leads to this kind of zero-sum game. And you have a situation now where family members are informing on each other. And this is something we never saw under the Mubarak regime. And that's going to take decades to undo, these scars that are so deep, even within families right now. And there's an Islamist journalist friend of mine who lives in Doha in exile now. And she was telling me just the other month how, her father considers her a terrorist. And, I'm for a lot, I don't know if you guys experienced this, but after 9/11, like my friends would joke around with me, oh, Shadi, you're a terrorist, haha, and it was kind of like somewhat amusing. But this is the real thing. Her father really thinks that she's a terrorist, and that's very, very scary. Now, I mean, so what does this really tell us? I mean, democracy is not simply a matter of faith. And when I was telling people after the coup, my Egyptian friends and colleagues, listen, guys, you hate the Brotherhood. Got it. Makes sense. But there is something called respecting democratic outcomes. And they would say, Shadi, you Americans and Westerners with your democracy and democratic outcomes, we're the ones living in this. So for them, they can put democracy to the side because for them, it's existential, it's raw, it's personal. If you have to suspend democracy for a year, 5 years, 10 years, so be it. And that's something that became, I think, very clear in Egypt and to some extent in the rest of the Arab world. Everyone says they believe in democracy, but do you really believe it when it matters? Now, this kind of leads me to a bigger issue about the role of ideology in the Arab world and this kind of divide over religion. And I might differ with Marwan a little bit. I do think the future is going to be quite ideological in the Arab world. I don't think ideology is a mask for other things. I don't think it's fundamentally about economics and class matter. They're part of the problem. But I think really at its core is this fundamental ideological divide. You have Arabs who see the world in very different ways, and I think we have to acknowledge that and confront that. This isn't just differing policies. It's not about, oh, do we support universal health care or not? No, these are fundamental core issues of nations and identities. And this kind of gets us to the tensions between liberalism and democracy, and Marwan touched on this as well. So for example, there was a 2011 Pew poll in Egypt, and here are some of the interesting numbers. So 70% of Egyptian respondents believed that the hands of thieves should be cut off. 80% of respondents believed that adulterers should be stoned. 88% said they believed in the death penalty for apostasy. 74% said they think Sharia or Islamic law should be the official law of the land. That gives you a little bit of a taste. And then in a 2012 YouGov poll on this issue of gender equality, only 18% of Egyptian respondents believe that a woman should be head of state. And even if you broke it down by gender, only 24% of Egyptian women believe that their fellow women should be head of state. Now, this kind of, this leads us to some, a challenging discussion. And this is actually one of the main themes that I discuss in my book, Temptations of Power. And I think copies will be available for both of our books after this panel. We think, as Americans growing up in America, we always, liberalism and democracy go together. That's how we grew up. We don't see them as being fundamentally, as being that separate. But what happens when you have majorities in Egypt, in Jordan, in Saudi Arabia, wherever it might be, who decide through the democratic process, large majorities who say, we don't want to be liberal, and we want to express our illiberalism through the democratic process? Then what do you do about that? And I mean, do Arabs have the right to try out an alternative ideological project? I mean, we talk a lot about the end of history, Francis Fukuyama's famous article in 1989. Liberal democracy is kind of the final endpoint of human civilization. But I think what we're realizing, it's not. And I may not be comfortable with the preferences of the majority of Egyptians one way or the other, but I think at the end of the day, self-determination is about Egyptians, Tunisians, Jordanians, whoever, deciding how they want to live their lives. And if their vision is more illiberal than ours as Americans, I think at the end of the day, you have to respect that. But that's where the tension is. And there are some people in these societies who don't want the democratic process to go forward because they feel threatened by the rise of Islamists or the rise of religious sentiment. It doesn't even have to be explicitly Islamist. And that is understandable. It is understandable to be afraid if you're a secularist, if you don't believe that religion should be a public thing, and you're afraid that it's not just policies, your lifestyle is going to be affected. The way you live, the way you dress, the way you interact with your family, the kind of social pressure that you feel on a daily basis, these are real things. But they're also, as I said, intangible. And I think if you look at Morsi, Mohammed Morsi and the Muslim Brotherhood's 1 year in power, they used a lot of Islamist and religious rhetoric, but they did very little in the way of actual Islamization. There was only one explicitly Islamic law passed on Sukuk bonds. It was uncontroversial, but that was pretty much it. So secularists they weren't just afraid of what Islamists were doing. It wasn't as much what Islamists were doing as much as what they might do in the future. It was a kind of speculative fear about 5 or 10 years down the road, and that becomes very difficult to address because it's not real yet. It might happen in the future. So how do you have a debate about that? So, I'll just kind of, I'll close, and Janine kind of touched on, the U.S. role. I mean, we haven't really talked about where the U.S. role is in all of this, and, I think that's an important discussion too. So if we have these existential zero-sum divides in the Arab world, then maybe it's better for Americans to just kind of take a step back and say, you guys got your stuff to deal with, and we can't do a lot about it because for you it's existential, and for us, we're kind of tired with the Middle East, and there's this real Middle East fatigue in this country, right? But I think a major opportunity was lost, and that was part of the hope that I felt in 2011. It wasn't just Arabs claiming their own future; it was that maybe finally, after decades of supporting autocratic regimes, we as Americans would finally get it right and say, that didn't work, it didn't lead to stability, and it provoked all of these uprisings because people wanted more. And in a way, we could have atoned for our sins. We could have tried to get it right this time. And I mean, this is a longer discussion. I think it's also a somewhat tragic discussion, is we didn't do that. There was this initial optimism, but it wasn't sustained. And we kind of withdrew to kind of business as usual, the old pre-2011 politics, and there wasn't actually a lot of, certainly economic support, but just more generally political and moral support for the Arab uprisings. I mean, the U.S. committed around $2 billion of new aid to the Arab Spring transitions, which isn't a lot. And just by comparison, the Marshall Plan in today's dollars, post-World War II, over $100 billion to help Europe recover. So the question, I mean, that's a pretty big difference. And, I was of the opinion that this was one of the world historical moments on par with 1848 or 1989, that the Arab world was going through a transformation, and it was time for the international community to step up to really seize the moment and help Arabs move in that positive direction. And I don't have a lot to say about, I think the opportunity was lost. I think the window has largely closed, and I think it's going to haunt us for years, if not decades to come. And I hate to end on that negative note, but I suppose I will. Thank you.
Thank you. As a reminder, if you have questions, please jot them down on your note cards. I'll get to as many as I can. We have to go back to the horrific model, Marwan, that you didn't get to, unfortunately, with Syria. But let's just, before we do that, let's just pick up on this discussion of the U.S. role, because several of you asked about it. Shadi, I don't think it's simply that they missed an opportunity. It was a choice, right? They tried for a few months. The U.S. and the West said, all right, Gaddafi can go. It was sort of made on a case-by-case basis. Who can go? They ousted Mubarak, or pushed him, or nudged him aside. Not that the U.S. ousted him, but they supported his ouster. And then I think there was this oh God moment in Washington, right? So it was a conscious decision, right, not to do that. And in the end, I think what we're seeing, I mean, you both referred to a coup, and I think it's no, you know, how much do you actually read about Egypt in the press today, right? Here, not that much, but both our speakers, interestingly, and I think naturally, chose to focus on Egypt because in one of these old sort of unsophisticated cliches, the way Egypt goes, the way the rest of the region goes, it's the linchpin of the region, right? They prefer the power of Sisi to this sort of Muslim Brotherhood version, right? It's neater. The United States did not call it a coup in July. They kept flowing aid there, even though there was a historic massacre. They chose to support Assad, even though President Obama said Assad has to go. The whole discussion in the U.S. has been about chemical weapons when you have 146,000 people dead. They held on to the Saudi King Abdullah for dear life, the same way they did to the Jordanian monarchy. So, I mean, the U.S. made its choice, right? And is trying to move on, unless you both see it differently.
Yeah, so look, I'm not sure how conscious that choice was, and I think part of the problem with the Obama administration is that it's kind of a blank canvas. So, I mean, dictators have been really angry at Obama for supporting, in their view, supporting the Arab Spring, but if you talk to revolutionaries and Democrats, they accuse the U.S. of supporting dictators. So both sides in the Arab world's divide think that the U.S. is supporting their opponent. And this is the question. I was living 4 years in Doha. I just moved back to D.C. a month ago. And this was the question that always came up. What does the U.S. want? There isn't any clarity on U.S. policy. And I think Obama's kind of philosophical instincts are, if there are ever two endpoints, you choose the middle. There's this almost kind of philosophical commitment to the center, regardless of where the center is, right? And I think that, you know, the Arab Spring was a time to make clear, to clarify what U.S. policy was. But I think you're right that the general thrust of U.S. policy was to say, business as usual, we have to rely on autocratic regimes. This is the reality. I think Libya and Syria kind of sucked out a lot of the optimism because until Libya, it was about nonviolent protest movements and Americans were very excited about it. But then Libya happened and it became bloody. It became effectively a civil war, right? And I think Syria is a big part of this story because, you know, in late 2011, early 2012, the Syrian opposition was literally begging the U.S. to get involved militarily. This wasn't Iraq where the U.S. just kind of imposed itself, that it was being demanded from the people who were struggling on the ground and they were being massacred on a daily basis. They didn't turn to China or Russia for help. They turned to the U.S. and that said something about how people view America's moral leadership. Despite all the bad things we've done over decades, in their time of need, revolutionaries and Democrats looked to us for moral leadership, and they couldn't find it.
And support, physical support. I think at that time they said, okay, we'll send you some night vision goggles or something.
Yeah,
it
was offensive.
Poultry.
It was offensive to them.
Marwan?
Look, the administration's philosophy from day one, when Obama came to office, even before the Arab uprising started, was to get America out of the Middle East. That has been always the philosophy. Of course, you know, putting aside for now the Arab-Israeli conflict in Israel. When the Arab uprising started 3 years ago, there was a moment when the United States, you know, stood on the side of change, but only as a matter of, I don't want to even say principle. That was misread, I think, by many to mean that that was going to be followed by a dramatic change of policy in which the United States was going to somehow be more involved in the Middle East. It didn't happen because the president does not believe in this. The president believes that he was elected on a mandate of withdrawing from the region, not getting more involved in it. And lately, he's been driven by what I think is the principal U.S. policy in the region, which is a deal with Iran. It is not the Arab-Israeli conflict, and it is not the Arab uprisings. The Arab uprisings today, ironically, is seen by this administration from the security prism.
Right.
In much the same way, ironically again, that the Bush administration saw the region from a security prism as well.
But Marwan, I'll just to jump, I mean, remember in 2004, well, you were ambassador in Washington then, right, I think? And George Bush, foreign minister, President Bush goes to the National Endowment for Democracy, and he says, I'm paraphrasing, you know, 60 years of American policy of supporting dictators in the Middle East will not stand, it's not sustainable. Now this is of course in the aftermath of 9/11, and this was sort of the feeling. So there's certainly, I mean, do you not think that President Bush, at least rhetorically, was a little bit more involved in these kinds of issues? I mean, of course it was before the Arab Spring.
I'm of the view, I mean, I don't think President Bush, you know, philosophy of affecting change in the region worked either. I mean, brute force, 500,000 troops in Iraq, 10 years after the war, what do you have to show for democracy in Iraq? The question is, this is a homegrown process. This is a process that is indigenous and it has to grow naturally. The United States cannot do much, or any other outside power cannot do much in the longer view of things to bring democracy to the Middle East. It has to be done from within. It can do certain things. I'm not saying it cannot do. One of the first things it can do is do no harm. Is do no harm. Don't support individuals as you did in the past. Support the process of democracy. Don't take sides. Don't say these are the good people and these are the bad people. This is something that the region has to decide for itself. It cannot be decided for it by the outside. And if there is something that it can do in the region, which is not the solution to all the problems, but it will certainly help other problems, is to solve the Arab-Israeli conflict. Unfortunately, I don't think that's a priority. I think the priority is a deal on Iran. Everything else is secondary to that.
If I could just, you know, add to that. I mean, it's odd in a way because in 2008, for a lot of us who supported Obama, he did seem to get the Middle East in a way that previous presidents hadn't. And if you, I mean, it's hard to remember it now. It's blurry.
Cairo speech.
The Cairo speech.
Yeah.
There was actually a Cairo speech, remarkably.
Yeah.
And that suggested that there was a real, genuine interest. But ultimately, I mean, Obama, I think, wanted so much to disavow the Bush era. And the Bush era, for better or worse, was very much tied to this quote-unquote freedom agenda. And I think some of it was reactive. Some of it was reactive. But I think there's also, and this isn't just Obama, it's also the national mood. There's a loss of faith in America's ability to do good in the world. We're starting to really doubt ourselves. Can we really do anything? You know?
You're seeing this with John McCain now attacking the president on Russia and Ukraine issues. I mean, but it's a contradiction, right? On the one hand, we're criticizing President Obama because he doesn't want to be involved and he's not managing this properly. On the other hand, we're saying, Marwan, this is an innate thing that's got to happen, grassroots in the region. So it's a complicated question. We're not going to resolve it in 15 minutes. I'm sorry, everyone. But seriously, we need to talk about Syria because 146,000 people have been killed in Syria, right? Since this began in early 2011. And we're referring it to, us journalists as civil war. It's now being called a genocide, okay, by the U.S. Holocaust Museum. And I don't hear anybody talking about Syria. The U.S. obviously is part of the discussion. Secretary Kerry's effort at what they're calling Geneva II, these negotiations isn't working. Marwan, you seem to play down the Al-Qaeda element, the Al-Qaeda concern in Syria a little bit. Did I mishear that?
No, it's not a matter of playing it down. I am convinced still that the majority of Syrian population are not radical and that Al-Qaeda does not have an environment conducive to it among the Syrian population. But just as in Iraq, Al-Qaeda and these people, make use of vacuums. Today we have a big vacuum in Syria. Neither side can win the war. Assad cannot exert his influence over all of Syria. The opposition is terribly disunited and cannot win a war either. The Syrian population are paying an extremely heavy price. I am, on a personal level, the first to say Assad will go, and I cannot imagine.
He will go.
And he will go. I cannot imagine a Syria with Assad in the future. I don't think that is a possibility. Unfortunately, to get to that point, is going to require a political process which is not existing. Geneva II has failed. It never had any big chance of success. The Russians and the Americans are not working on this. The Russians have their own agenda. The Americans are not going to intervene militarily. The countries of the region themselves are divided over this issue. The Saudis are, supporting one group. Qatar is supporting another, for example, and that is adding to the problem rather than to the solution. So, and then you have a refugee crisis, which is simply unsustainable. Today, in Jordan and Lebanon, you have at least 20% of the population of each country of Syrian refugees. I mean, it is equivalent to getting all of the population of Canada, all of it to the United States. It is simply unsustainable. But yet, I cannot, sort of romantically tell you, I hope a solution will come about soon. I don't think it will.
So you're looking at prognostication in the Middle East is dangerous.
I think we are going to look at years. The latest figures today that I read are 146,000 Syrians have already died. Syria has lost 40% of its GDP. In another year, it would have lost 60% of its GDP. If the war ends tomorrow morning, it's going to take Syria 10 years to achieve the Millennium Development Goals of the UN. They have lost a generation of development. It's a disaster on all levels. But unfortunately, there is no quick solution because politically, neither the international community, whether justifiably or not, is not going to intervene.
Shadi, do you want to add to that? Or
yeah, but that's part of the problem. I agree with Marwan that this Obama administration does not want to intervene militarily in Syria. They never did, even when it actually could have been successful early on, before the rise of radicalism, before the civil war got much worse. And I remember, I came out in support for military intervention in February 2012, and I remember writing that article. I looked back at it recently. Only about 5,000 or 6,000 had died by that point. Just think about that for a second. And we thought that was I thought that's a red line. 6,000, 7,000. We have to stop this. Now it's 146,000. I mean, I just don't even know what to say. And I've had this debate. We had this debate at the time. What would the trigger be for the U.S.? And I remember on Twitter, I kind of said, well, maybe 15,000 will be the Twitter. That sounds like a lot of people, but not even close. Not even close. And this is where external actors can really play a role. I mean, you have a very kind of stable, in a way, stalemate in Syria. Neither side can vanquish the other, and that's why the external factor is really important. There's no way the rebels are going to win without more international and particularly American support. It doesn't have to be military intervention per se, but the kind of lack of any real significant lethal assistance to the Syrian rebels. I mean, we're just talking about arms. They've been wanting to have man-pads for the last 2 years and advanced weaponry to defend themselves from the Assad regime, and they can't even get that from the U.S.
Shadi, we went into Libya with Article 5. We went in and just took out Gaddafi, the West. We didn't bother with, are we going to give man-pads or what kind of night vision goggles to these people? They just made a decision, right? I mean, so that's one route that's being debated. But there's this, my personal view, and who cares what I think, but you have the Iranians and the Saudis are the main players. Am I wrong on this, you guys? Iranians and Saudis in Syria, in terms of external actors. We're like a distant United States, like, we're not even, I mean, and unless we get that, and that's never, they're not talking really. So, I mean, for me, it's got to be external actors. I just think it's a disaster, and I think, the fact that we're not talking about it, remember we were talking about it if there was no YouTube video of those poor people being gassed in Syria last summer, I don't know if we ever would have talked about Syria in the United States, honestly, in any kind of way. And it was too fleeting, and I'm worried that we're going to have another Bosnia. It's like, it's already that, right? A lot of people, just shifting gears, because again, we can't resolve any of these things here this morning, but just touch on them, are picking up, Marwan, on what you said about your generation's failure to sort of bring, transform or be leaders in democracy. And I know you personally are going to embark on a new initiative in Jordan. Some people want to know about Jordan as well. And maybe you could talk a little bit about how you are going to translate your own warnings and directives into action on the ground.
ironically, the countries that have not undergone transitions in the Arab world, or most of them at least, belong to the monarchies of the Arab world. There are 8 monarchies of the Arab world, 6, 5.5 that are rich, and I don't know how you consider Bahrain, and the 2 poor monarchies of Jordan and Morocco. In the case of the rich monarchies, they have attempted to deal with the situation basically through financial means. In the case of Bahrain, through security means as well. And in fact, the money was able to at least slow down the process. I don't think it can do that for the foreseeable future, and there are already indications in Kuwait, in Bahrain to the contrary, and even in Saudi Arabia. And then you have the poor monarchies of the Arab world, Jordan and Morocco, who have attempted to do this by what I will call ad hoc reforms that might have advanced the case of political reform in one area or another, but that don't simply add up to a comprehensive reform process that will result at the end in power sharing, in strengthening the legislative, in strengthening the judicial branches of government, in mitigating the dominance of the executive branch on all aspects of life. And as such, these countries use whatever legitimacy they have, and they do have legitimacy for different reasons. They use it as an excuse to do nothing, rather than as a way to supervise a reform process that is not going to result in their ousting from power. These systems, I mean, Jordan, the monarchy in Jordan is not under threat. All the ethnic groups in Jordan want the monarchy to stay, because it wants the monarchy to be an arbiter among them. But they also don't want the monarchy or the system to remain as closed as it is. They want a wider say in decision making. They want strong parliaments. They want to feel they are represented in a way that has been lacking so far. I also believe, as I said, that the discourse that I was talking about, that is one that believes in a civil state and that believes in democracy at all times, and one that believes also in bringing about economic solutions to the country's problems and not just simply suffice lecturing people about democracy and human rights and women's rights, which are all important, but in the end, people want to also know that their lot will be improved. That discourse that has all these elements so far is not a discourse that that is politically mobilized or organized anywhere in the Arab world. There are individual voices or small forces that are calling for such a pluralistic discourse, but so far they like me, are doing it from behind podiums.
Leaving just the secularists and the Islamists to kind of...
Exactly, and just pontificating to everyone. Okay, I don't believe in that. I believe that you have to really work on the ground and not expect quick results, and not expect that you're going to go there just for the short term or to win an election or to achieve any personal glory. That this is going to take decades of hard work without expecting many results to come. I plan to do that myself. I'm going back in July, and I'm in touch a lot with the youth in Jordan, particularly the youth in Jordan, who really do believe in what I'm saying, but who are still frustrated, leaderless, need help in developing their own programs, but understand that this zero-sum game, cannot be sustainable. I mean, this fight, this stupid fight between people just vying to come to power, really, without providing solutions to people's problems, cannot go on like this. And I believe such a discourse need to be developed over decades, not just in Jordan, but throughout the Arab world. And I would like at least to contribute to that process.
Shadi, I know you, for your book and your research, have interviewed so many of the younger generation, and and we're sitting here not far from Silicon Valley, and there's a lot of questions here about globalization, new technologies, the next generation being hip to all of this, and these old forces of Islam and things. I mean, does Marwan's project, can it succeed? Can he rally, can it work in Jordan and elsewhere?
I certainly hope so.
Be honest.
Look, so, okay, one of the problems, relatively speaking, the younger generation is better than the older generation just because the bar is very low. But Marwan being actually one of the notable exceptions to this. You know, I feel like one problem I had 2011 with all the hype about Twitter, Facebook, here are these young, fluffy liberals who speak English and talk like us. Oh, liberals, great. I mean, we were projecting as Americans. We wanted to believe in something that wasn't necessarily real. And that's always our tendency. We want to see people who look and talk like us, but they weren't. I mean, yes, there were those people, but they were the most prominent or the most available on the Western media. But there was also a strong Muslim Brotherhood presence in Tahrir Square, and they downplayed their participation, so we didn't pay a lot of attention to that. There were also a lot of Salafis in Tahrir Square, and no one wanted to talk about the rise of the Salafis, but the Salafis, the kind of ultra-conservative literalist Muslims, turned out to be much more powerful forces than the young technocratic liberals, and we didn't want to see that. So I think we have to be careful about this idolization of youth. And actually, the big movement that supported the military coup and the subsequent massacre was a youth movement. Tamarrud was a youth movement. And they supported the things that we all think are bad. So it can go both ways. And I think that even if you look at generational divides in groups like the Muslim Brotherhood, we shouldn't always assume that the younger generation is the more open-minded and pragmatic. In some cases, they're the more revolutionary, they're the more confrontational, they're the more susceptible to violence because they're angry and they're frustrated with the older generation or the way things have been done in the past. So, I mean, I think we have to be a little bit careful, be careful what we wish for. Youth is a mixed bag.
I feel sad when you say that because I remember, you know, I've been thinking this last week, and I shared this with Marwan last night. When you look at Egypt, Ahmed Maher, who was one of the leaders of what was called the April 6th movement, who I went and interviewed in 2010, is in jail. He was one of these people who really helped bring out people to Tahrir Square. I don't want to totally think that this was an Anderson Cooper invention, that we read it this way, the journalists who were there at the time, right? I mean, and now he's in jail. And Ahmed Ez, who is Egypt's leading steel tycoon accused of enormous corruption, was released this week, okay? Which, you know, I'm just going to call it, right? We're going to call it now. The Arab Spring of 2011 in Egypt, the question was, Mubarak's gone, but will Mubarakism continue? And Mubarakism has continued in the form of Sisi, right?
Oh, look.
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah,
I was going to say, I wish you were right. I mean, Mubarak was the golden age compared to this, and I think you can't even. No, I mean, the level of repression is not comparable. There were no massacres or killings on the street under Mubarak.
He withheld those tanks. You know, those tanks sat there, and he didn't shoot at the people.
Yeah, but also in terms of his 30 years in power, right, he was an autocrat. But he at least allowed a little room for the opposition. There was at least a pretense that there was some opposition press. There were opposition members of parliament. He wasn't trying to eradicate the opposition. What I think is really scary about the new regime in Egypt, they don't want to marginalize the opposition. They want to destroy it, eradicate it, erase it by any means necessary. And it's remarkable. The numbers just came out recently, Washington Post article last week. 21,000 people have been arrested since the coup. That's 7 months. You know, 21,000. Just think about that for a second, you know?
Marwan, these are the people you need for your movement, a lot of these people.
Look, I don't think you look at a few months in Egypt's history this year and then judge that all of Egypt's future is going to be like this just because of the developments of the last few months. Remember last year what we said about Egypt? The Muslim Brotherhood is going to be dominant in the country for 30 years. Didn't we all say that? Where is the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt today? So don't in jail. But in jail with the approval of a large segment of Egyptian society, as Shadi said. It's not in jail just because the military brought them to jail. What I'm saying is we are witnessing, you know, a process that is not smooth, that is going to go through ups and downs. Don't judge it just by looking at what is going on a particular month or a particular even year. It's going to take some time. You know, I mean, we all, once again, in 2004, we all thought Ukraine is going to achieve democracy overnight. It still has not happened. It's not a sexy message, I'm sorry, but it is the truth.
We need quick answers, we need to solve it all.
It is the truth. You know? Things take time. Look at history and it tells you that things take time. Shadi talked about 1848, you know, the first revolution took place in France in 1789, and then if you all saw The Miserable, right? You see what happened later on, and things take time, and it's going to go through ups and downs.
Yeah, I mean, look, I agree. I mean, I believe autocracies don't last forever. They're going to fall at some point, at least that's what I think. But the problem is, how long is the long run, and how much do people suffer in the process? I mean, the scars in Egyptian society now are going to take decades to overcome because they're very deep. They're societal. It's not just, as Marwan said, the military putting the Brotherhood in prison. There's passionate, enthusiastic support from millions of Egyptians for that repressive course. And again, when you have this kind of civil conflict, I mean, when Egyptians look back, how are they going to talk about this? They're going to have to say, how did we do this? What did we become? There's going to have to be truth and reconciliation. And you're going to have to, you know, they're really going to have to dig deep and ask themselves some very uncomfortable questions. That's a long process. And, you know, the cost is going to be high.
It is, but it's doable. And in a place like Egypt, I think that has, you know, has a civil society, has a long history of bureaucracy, has a national identity. I mean, Egyptians think of themselves as Egyptians and have thought of themselves as Egyptians long before their modern nation state was created. These are all elements that are positive, okay? Egypt will still go maybe through 20 years of this you know, charade, whatever is going on there. It might take them 20 years, but I don't think, Shadi, it will take longer. I mean, France and Germany killed millions of each other. Yeah. In World War II, millions of each other, but they're still, you know, they're not the best of friends, but they're they're okay. You know?
Yeah.
Marwan, you're being optimistic.
Look.
No, yes, I like it. It's so hard to have a conversation about this stuff.
You know, because if I'm pessimistic, if everybody is pessimistic about the future, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. Mm-hmm. Then we might as well lock the doors and, you know, leave the Arab world to drown. You cannot be except optimistic. You cannot just write the regions off. And history tells you that nothing is permanent. Nothing. It's up to you to do. I mean, this is a battle that should have started in the Arab world post-independence, right? I mean, all the battle of the contemporary Arab world, that's why I call it the second Arab awakening. The first Arab awakening, you know, worried about independence, and intellectuals in the Arab world and later on popular movements worried about getting rid of Ottoman rule and colonial rule. And they did that. But once they did that, they stopped. They didn't worry about democracy. They didn't worry about pluralism. They didn't worry about putting in place, you know, stable and sustainable systems. And we're paying the price for this today. So this is a battle that should have started 70 years ago. But at least it started. Okay, it's 70 years too late. It started. I'm not going to judge it in 3 years, and I'm not going to give up.
So we only have like 8 minutes left, and I have the two very important questions, and they're very big. So I don't know. I'm just going to throw them out here based on what people are writing here, and one which occurred to me I should have asked in the beginning. Now, we're talking about small d Democrats and liberalism and all these things, but the real macro issue is Sunni and Shia as well, and I feel like we can't have this conversation without talking about Sunni versus Shia, especially in the context of Syria and Iraq, which we barely touched on, and how that's going to affect this future trajectory. And then I'm sort of reluctant to go into the last issue, but obviously there's a lot of people asking about Israel and how it relates, and you made a reference, Marwan, to saying that the U.S. needs to solve the Israel issue, that this sort of, and other people saying, doesn't this all show that Israel's really not the heart of the matter there? So I don't know if one of you wants to take one and the other and...
Okay, sure.
You know.
I mean, let me start with the latter. I mean, so I used to be of the school of thought that Israel-Palestine was the central Arab grievance, and if we didn't address that, then the region was going to just be a mess indefinitely. I have revised my position. I don't believe it's the heart of the matter. I don't. It's a very important grievance, and it should be resolved. It has to be resolved. But I think even if you did have a two-state solution, you know, the bigger issues are these internal divides in the 20 or so Arab countries about their own process of democratization or lack thereof, of Islamist versus secularist, or Shia versus Sunni. And we're seeing that now. In the past 3 years, Israel-Palestine hasn't been the #1 issue for the Arab world. People are focusing inward, and quite frankly, most of these regimes are more brutal to their own Arab populations than the Israelis are to the Palestinians, as repressive as Israel has been, and we have to acknowledge that. It quite frankly doesn't compare to what Arabs do to each other in their own countries. So I think you have to kind of look at it in perspective. And look, the US has a limited bandwidth, especially with this administration that sees the Middle East, let's be frank, as a nuisance. They just leave us alone. We don't want to deal with this. So I think it's a problem that we're using a lot of our bandwidth to try to solve the Arab-Israeli conflict, which quite honestly is probably not going to be resolved. The two sides are so far apart. We can talk about framework agreements all we want, but we're not close. We're not close now, and Kerry is there. He's putting so much of the emphasis on that, and that takes away from the other things we can and should be doing on what I consider to be the more pressing issues.
Marwan?
I, first of all, don't think, Janine, the central issue is the Sunni-Shiite divide. I think the central issue is the lack of respect for diversity in the Middle East. Sometimes it shows itself in the Sunni-Shiite divide. Sometimes it shows itself in the Kurdish issue. Sometimes it shows itself in the Muslim-Christian issue. It is all because of this outdated notion of citizenship. We still don't have a modern nation notion of citizenship in the Arab world, where a national identity trumps all other sub-identities. And this is particularly true in the eastern part of the Arab world. You know, modern-day creations, countries that are modern-day creations through the Sykes-Picot Agreement, where different ethnic and religious groups were just bundled together without any sense of a national identity. And in the 100 years that separate us from Sykes-Picot, no effort has been exerted, serious effort, to create any sense of national identity in these countries, and to create a respect for diversity, that not everybody is supposed to think the same, act the same, etc. Until we do that, then I'm afraid the future is not going to be promising. On the Israeli issue, look, I've become, you know, I'm somebody who worked on the Arab-Israeli issue since Madrid. I was the Jordanian spokesman at the Madrid peace process. I was Jordan's first ambassador to Israel. I had a key role in writing the Arab Peace Initiative, a key role in writing the Middle East Roadmap. I don't want, and I'm honestly sick of getting into the argument of, you know, whether it is relevant or irrelevant. I know this, and I say it everywhere in a very vocal way. If Israel does not work, for a two-state solution, it is going to be the end of the Jewish state, okay, period. Israel is not going to survive in the midst of 380 million Arabs if it does not itself work for a viable two-state solution. And then, you know, the rest is up to it. But without getting into this argument, there is no country in the world that has been able to rule indefinitely over another people, which will be a majority in Israel sometime soon. There's no other country in the world that has been able to do so. Israel will not be able to do so. Whether it creates walls around itself, whether It is simply not going to be able to do so. You have a situation today in areas under Israel's control where the number of Arabs and the number of Jews is exactly the same. 6 million Arabs to 6 million Jews. It is no longer a demographic problem that can be ignored. You can ignore it for another 10 years, 20 years, 30 years. In the end, without a two-state solution, it is not a favor to the Palestinians. It is a favor to the survival of Israel as a Jewish and democratic state.
Unfortunately, we're out of time. And with that, please join me in thanking Ambassador Marwan Muasher and Shadi Hamid for their enlightening remarks.